Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second installment of our focus on Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month. And of course, the focus is on that topic, spiritual abuse. And today we're going to be talking about what is a spiritual abuser. And so we're very excited again to have Dr. Grant Jones, psychologist, back with us, and then also psychologist Nathan Davis and counselor Beth Davis joining us as well as part of our crew that's helping address this vitally important topic. As I mentioned last week when we began this series, I really had no clue until November of this year, maybe late October, that there was such a thing as Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month. But as I did a little research, this has actually been going on for 10 years. And I think it's something that came to awareness for us is because of what we've heard about and what we've experienced and so forth in people's lives and various things. It's become a topic that's risen to the top in several areas that has caused us to say this would be a great time to be able to have a focus upon spiritual abuse so that we can define it, so that we can discuss it, and then know how healing can come when that has been something an individual or a group has experienced. And so, with that, with no further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Jones and to Nathan and Dr. Beth Davis. So, Grant, lead us.
Um, just let me way of introduction here. Let me real quick, just because some of you may be new. Um, I'm a retired faculty member from Evangel University, a psychologist in the state of Missouri. I still do clinical work. My mom and dad were missionaries to, I just noticed someone just direct texted me from Zaire, where my parents were missionaries for a while, and Senegal and Malawi. So I just love what I'm doing as a psychologist. And then the clinical reason I became a psychologist was to help the missionary family. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 35 years and honored to do that. And so this is an interesting venture for me, as many, I say some of my former students there. And so I'm not techie savvy. So we got through last week. So praise God. Um, the I gave reference. I'll have them again at the end here that I'll pull up share screen, take pictures of it, or email me grantjonesphd@gmail.com, and I'll send you all the documents that I've got. All right. Um, so I just want to, I appreciate all the feedback that we got from last week. Thank you for your kind comments. And we just really believe the Lord was with us and the Holy Spirit was guiding us. And the questions that you have were awesome. And so thank you again. So let me dive in. This preparing for this particular presentation was eye-opening to me. It was like, whoa. This information has been around since 1991 and 92, and we still have problems with it today. Some of the major players that have been in the news in recent years, you will recognize these names, and all of these fall under the category of spiritual abuser. You got Mark Driscoll at Mars Hill, James McDonald at Harvest Bible Church, Jerry Falwell fits in that category, and then Steve Timmis, Acts 29. These individuals are representative of pastors that have been spiritual abusers. You can go to Google them, Seattle Times, World Magazine, Christianity Today. All of them have the in-depth stories about these individuals. So that's there, and it's still happening. And so I'm just sad and excited. I don't know if you can do that at the same time, but that's where I'm at. And I'm a very transparent person. And so there'll probably be times I may end up doing some crying or teary, and we'll just, that's just me. What's fascinating, and I'm in the weeds a little bit, I cry at commercials. My daughter-in-law, we cry together at movies. But in the therapy counseling session, I can't remember a time I cried with my clients. That was, so it's kind of weird. And they know I'm tender-hearted, but somehow in this counseling session, it doesn't seem to come out. But anyway, so what I want to do, I want to pull up a screen here, signs of a spiritual, let me share my screen. Okay. There we go. Okay, this, a great book, great book. Everybody should have this on. If you are in Christian leadership, organization, deacon, pastor, elder, you must get Michael Kruger's book, The Bully Pulpit, Confronting the Problem of Spiritual Abuse in the Church. His reference will be at the end, but so why does he, and we talked about this last week, spiritual abuse is probably the worst kind of abuse there is, because it harms people's core spiritual identity, religious identity, your purpose and meaning, your values, all of that gets questioned. And we'll talk, I'm excited about in 2 weeks to talk about how to heal from it. But Michael also says it makes Christianity look like a fraud, that it doesn't change, it doesn't mean anything. And the core ingredients, just a quick review of spiritual abuse, is someone in an ecclesiastical position that uses power, authoritarianism, heavy and harsh-handedness to control, manipulate, and direct people, primarily for their well-being. And here's some Old Testament examples that are just fascinating to me. And the parallel between then and now is phenomenal. Rehoboam, all right, going to become king. His dad had put heavy-handed taxes on everybody. And so he takes over and he talks to his elders, and they say, hey, you need to be gentle servant and some of the burden on the people. And then he talked to his younger guys who said, no, be even harsher and heavy-handed and get more money. Let them know who's boss. And we all know the story. It destroyed Israel. And then the shepherds of Israel. This is Ezekiel 34. The purpose of a shepherd is to protect the flock, to provide for the flock, to lead for the flock, actually sacrifice for the flock. But what Ezekiel is telling them, the shepherds of Israel, they ruled the sheep with force. Look at that, force and harshness, and wounded them. And two great examples, sons of Eli, Phinehas and Hophni, who just ruled with an iron hand, and they made the Israelites do extra sacrifices for themselves, not for the people. And the Lord took care of them in a rather disastrous way. And Eli also suffered. He knew it was going on, and he didn't stop it. So he was disciplined as well by God. And then in the New Testament, there are several accounts that have come up. And I'm only doing this just to put backdrop to where we're going today. So false prophets who come in what? Sheep's clothing. So they look like a sheep, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. And this is Jesus talking. And I'm trying to scroll down. Teachers of the law and the Pharisees, you hypocrites, you are like whitewashed tombs. which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead men's bones and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as what? Righteous, but on inside, you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. These were the leaders of the times. And that was and here's another one. Teachers of the law, Pharisees, you hypocrites, you give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former, you blind guides. And then Paul and Peter, both of them talk about the shepherds of the flock. Now, these are church leaders. These are individuals that were believers, converts, who lead with arrogance. And look at that word, bullying. Paul said that in 1:3, and not in a gentle and lowly way. Or you lead for one's own gain and in a domineering way. And the term there is to lord it over. Peter says, and being eager to serve and being examples of the flock. Those are the words of Jesus, Peter, and Paul talking to the Christian leaders, leaders of the church. So, summary of what a true Christian leader is. All right. Not lording it over, but being a what? Servant. Not a bully, but gentle. Not for shameful gain or personal gain, but serving eagerly, meaning giving to others. Not domineering, but setting an example of gentleness and humility. And look at this last one, not quarrelsome, but kind. So that's kind of from a biblical perspective, the metaphor for both Old Testament and New Testament is shepherd. That's a leader, a shepherd, the priest. And think of what a shepherd does. It's not about him or her, it's about the sheep. Taking care of them, providing for them, nurturing them, protecting them, rescuing them, going after them when they're lost. And Jesus and God both harshly condemn leaders that were not care of the flock. So that's the context. Shepherd, gentle. Oh, one of the things that I'm curious to those of you that have, what is going on there? Have you ever heard of what, gang? I am apologizing. What in the world is going on here? Can you see the background?
Yes.
All that stuff on my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. I don't see anybody right. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, we're just seeing the Word document that you put up.
Okay. All right. I'm just, my apologies. I'll get this other out of the way. Okay, here we go. So I want to pull up another document, and this is the first one that actually gets into some specifics. Nope. You know what? It just, there we go. You guys. I had everything on the board here and now I don't see.
Nathan and Beth, as Grant is locating
Hi.
the next document, is there you want to add?
While he's doing that, there's a lot of different ways to approach, what is an abuser, who is he like? And back when I was working in the Air Force Research Lab, and shortly afterwards, I was privileged to be able to do a personality assessment of various groups of ministers. Some Assemblies of God, some Methodists, some hospital chaplains, which are cross-denominational, and seminary students. And to my horror, the personality assessments showed that across all the different groups that I studied, the ministers were higher than the norm for the entire US population, higher than the norm in neuroticism. And neuroticism is defined as being nervous and stressed out, worry, having a short temper, which that's a real concern for ministers. And the big gotcha for me was that they were very high in envy. And in fact, most of the groups were down around the norm for the entire population, except for the Assemblies of God, who were one full standard deviation above the norm in envy. So, we look at this as what is a abuser does, or you can look at it as who is he internally? And basically internally, they end up being people who envy what others are doing and the position and recognition they receive. And so there's an internal character difference that the abuser has. And the bad news is it's difficult to change that on your own. The good news is that the spiritual disciplines attack the neuroticism factors or facets faster than any other. And so, maybe God gives us the spiritual disciplines for a purpose, because they actually do change who we are internally. And those who practice the spiritual disciplines end up having a much lower scores in envy in particular. So my perspective research shows that actually, in addition to our behavior being different as abusers, and I want to point out that all of us, especially if you're my age, by the time you get this old age, you have been an abuser one or more times. It's part of the human condition. So it's easy for me to point a finger at abusers in general. And when I do it, I have fingers pointing back at myself, because all of us need to start with the reflection of who am I and what have I done? And so when we talk about abusers, start with reflection, but also start with saying, how do I score in envy? Do I envy what other people have? Do I envy the recognition that others get? That's a big one for ministers. And do I envy the ministry, the high visibility ministry that someone else has? Or maybe they have a more meaningful ministry in your eyes. I want to say in God's eyes, but in your eyes, you might think they have a more meaningful ministry, and you envy that. The point is that envy is the root of sin. In the Garden of Eden, it was the root of the sin of Adam and Eve. They didn't just eat an apple or fruit, but they envied being like God. And that's why they ate the apple. And it was the envy of Satan, who wanted to be like God. It's the root of virtually all sin. All sin and 10 commandments starts with envy. So when we see that ministers in general are no different than the average North American, who may or may not even be Christian, it causes concern. When we see that a group of ministers in one particular denomination score a full standard deviation. A standard deviation is a huge difference. When they score a full standard deviation higher than the North American norm of people who are not even Christians, some of them are, but as a general rule, they're secular. And when they score a full standard deviation higher in envy, it raises my concern. It raises my eyebrow, saying, who are we internally? That ends up causing and driving abusive behavior. So, I hope that Grant has gotten things back situated. I think
I'm ready.
Yeah,
Good.
that's good. Good.
Thanks. Appreciate that, Nathan. So this is Jill Monaco, came across her research. She had 25 signs of spiritual abusive leaders. So I just summarized 10 of them. I want to put these on here. I got another list, and then I'm going to come back to a summary. Spiritual abusive leaders don't allow themselves to be held accountable or corrected and bully anyone who disagrees. We're going to come back. Where's the accountability? Spiritually abusive leaders demand to be served instead of serving. Abusive leaders demand their way over subordinates' free will. They then scare them with threats to their reputation if they don't comply, or they shame them by bringing up past failures or mistakes. Abusive leaders betray subordinates' confidence and share that information with others, especially in leadership meetings. You tell your supervisor, this is where I'm struggling, and then he or she then tells above them. Spiritual abusive leaders twist the truth to make themselves look better. The person then the person that's questioned ends up questioning if they heard them correctly or misinterpreting something. Or they would also say, that's not really what I said, but yet they did. They silence their critics by making them the bad guy and or the problem, and then gaslight them into thinking they are crazy, usually along the lines that they're not a true loyal follower of Christ or the mission. So that gaslighting is a big, big deal in leadership that are abusive. Spiritually abusive leaders cannot admit fault, but they use the knowledge of other faults to cause fear, intimidation, and control. And all those people that I referenced, the Driscolls and the McDonalds, they all did this. It's documented. Spiritually abusive leaders use their charisma to create a cult-like following that defends them when they are questioned, as well as they have a popular inner circle where one is discharged from it if issues or concerns are raised, thus silencing others from speaking up. Oh, this one is, spiritually abusive leaders have their minions do their dirty work and isolate, intimidate, and manipulate those who do not comply. So there's kind of a gap there. And then this is the last one I'll close from her list. Spiritually abusive leaders view those who bring up legitimate issues as enemies of the church or the mission. Those who were once friends and allies can swiftly become enemies once a legitimate concern is raised. Sometimes these folks are better another assignment, kicked out of the fellowship, told to be silent, or shamed into submission. And that's what Michael Kruger is saying. This stuff goes on for years. There's reports of it. There's concerns, but those concerns are minimized, ignored, blacklisted, or you go after the messenger and not the message. So let me do this. I'm going to stop sharing this. Any questions on this real quick or comments while I am sliding to another slide?
You can unmute yourself and ask the question live, or you could also put it in the chat box as well. So feel free to do that now.
Okay. So what is a spiritual abuser? And this is Michael, oh, I said Brugger, it's Kruger, sorry. And then I'm going to go to another list. But this is his research from his studies. Abusers usually have a fruitful, gospel-centered ministry with a track record of success. And that success is more buildings, more congregants, more missionary endeavors, and much more money. And money is often a key component to this. So on the outside, they're very successful. They'll go to conferences and seminars. They'll be special speakers. They'll write books. And everybody thinks, whoo, wonderful. And they are. But according to Mike, most spiritual abusers have narcissistic tendencies. And not all, but a vast majority. And Nathan, I think your research was, with personality stuff kind of gives credence to that.
Let me interrupt right here. We do have a question, and it ties in to this first point and also back to Nathan's point. And the question, I think, is more directed to Nathan at this point. Nathan, where was that study of AG ministers and that they were higher than the norm in envy? Do you have any links or any resources to share if that makes it easier?
Nathan, unmute yourself. Nathan, you're muted.
Okay.
There
Yes,
you
the book I'm actually on the chat box right now, putting in the title. It's called Spiritual Integration, Spiritual Formation, and the 5-factor model. I'll get that. I'll first of all verify it by looking at the book itself, make sure I get the title right. I've published about 10 books, so sometimes I get the titles mixed up. So I'll go get the book, and then I'll type the title into the chat box.
Can I say while we're here, Grant, since talking of last week, several people have either messaged me or talked to me personally about the new use of the word narcissism, because I think a lot of people have suddenly realized that this is a common term that we're throwing out. Is there a short definition that you can help us with to know when we talk about characteristics of a narcissist, just a handle on that?
Absolutely. Great question. And that's a narcissist has about 3 key characteristics. One, they believe they are entitled to preferred treatment because they're special. They're the best. There's that sense that I am talented, I'm skilled, I'm attractive, and I am entitled to special favors, and what applies to others doesn't apply to me. Another key characteristic is the lack of empathy and lack of concern for other people in their well-being, especially when that person is not helping them. So the empathy, the connectivity of someone else's pain can be absent from his or her awareness. So that entitlement, I demand respect, and then what is also what Nathan marked and mentioned is if they have a temper, they can get, when they don't get their way, they can be extremely volatile, verbally, sometimes physically. So but the core issue is I am better than others, and therefore I deserve preferential better treatment, and the laws and the procedures and policies that apply to others don't apply to me because I am better and I'm more entitled to that.
Thank you.
And then the lack of empathy goes along with that. And so they can be very gifted. I mean, there's a, lot of gifted professionals, doctors, lawyers that you would want them to do work for you, but you would not want to be friends with them because they just don't connect. Very egocentric and egotistical. Thank you. Another thing that happens is abuse happens for years, leaving a long debris field of broken relationships before it catches up to the abuser. And Mike talks about the dead bodies and he used that metaphorically, of course, of relationships that have been just totally destroyed and gone and ignored and their weight. And so it takes a long time for all those stories to come out. And most of the time it's isolation, diminished, signing a letter of non, what's the word? You can't bring charges against the organization.
Disclosure.
Pardon that, Mark?
Non-disclosure.
Yeah.
Non-disclosure. Yeah, you sign that off in order to get your compensation or your retirement or severance or something like that.
Good point.
It involves this is over and over. It involves domineering, bullying behavior, leaving the abused in genuine fear, especially if it involves threats of church discipline or being discharged from the organization. This is what I became aware of for years, is when I've talked to different people, the terror of talking it keeps them in silence. I've talked to individuals where they didn't even want their names mentioned. Just put my initial down, because they're so terrified that some would get back to the organizational leadership and then they would be punished or disciplined. But terror, and that's I'll just say this: any organization where terror and fear is a primary emotion, you know something's wrong. You have to know something is wrong if there is terror and fear-based motivation for behavior. This is the one that hurts too. Reports of abuse rarely lead to accountability, as friends defend the abuser and the board, often members younger in age and little experience. Remember who Rehoboam listened to? The older ones or the younger ones? They provide an alternate explanation to protect the leader, the guru, the bishop, the master, whatever. And so the accountability, and then the victims of the abuse are typically forced out and charged as troublemakers who are attacking a faithful pastor doing his job. It's fascinating that in my sphere of work and whatever, that as I collect some stories, it's then I'm seen as the troublemaker, not the people that I'm getting stories about, but because I am collecting the stories. So there's something wrong with me. And that's tough, but hey, that's I expect that now. And I guess I'm not alone in that process of trying to help people, because you've got to be a voice for people. And we'll get to that part a little bit later. Any comments, questions so far? And I'm going to stop this screen and bring up another one.
Dr. Jones, can I hop in for a sec?
Please.
One question, and if this is kind of in the agenda to get to either later today or in later weeks, that's also fine. One dynamic that I've personally experienced and been curious about would be, so especially with a narcissistic person, sometimes they have a different definition of abuse or justice in their minds. That's really difficult. So to make a long story very short and still fairly vague, I was just terminated from a position for trying to gently confront some behavior that I considered bullying and domineering, and I tried to do it very by the book and everything. long story short, in the termination meeting, I was being dismissed and totally unheard. And finally, I just lost it for a second. And I said, this person's been abusing me for 6 years. And the immediate reply from the board member was, no, he hasn't.
Exactly.
And that captured. So I walked away from that meeting thinking, okay, I think we just have different definitions of abuse.
Mhm.
You know, I was feeling the some of the specifics that you've mentioned, frankly. But the perception on the other side, which then included kind of the team that number 5 on the screen references, the team of
Mhm.
supporters, the perspective was sort of belittling and dismissing, and it was just a different definition. And that's been incredibly hard and difficult to navigate. So I know that's a big question, but I think it's one that maybe others are wrestling with as well. In
Mhm.
that abusive dynamic, what do you do when the abuser not only denies, or I suppose simply disagrees, but also sort of strong arms everyone else into their definition of, no, my behavior is justified.
Right. It's like it's for the greater good, or it's the mission, or
Correct.
and you are, you know, questioning God's anointed and authority. And I thank you for sharing. I really, and sucks. I hate it.
And God is still good. God's going to do things.
Yeah.
Also, we want to figure out ways to help
Yeah.
the abuser as well.
Yes.
And so it's that weird tension of, you know, I'm not just going to walk away and say,
Mhm.
yes, okay, what you did was
Yeah.
fine. I want to hold people accountable in
Yeah.
love. But how do you persuade someone who just doesn't think that they abused
No.
you?
And I've had some interesting meetings where I want to say, well, what do you mean abuse is going on? There's nothing sexual going on. There's nothing physical going on. There's nothing, you know, that we know monetarily, misuse of funds. So what do you mean spiritual abuse? And it was really eye-opening in that conversation and it is the most damaging thing. Because it questions everything when you do that. And we'll come back to that. Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate that. And so, because there's a couple other things that'll illustrate that as well. But you've referenced it there. You've got individuals that, well, I'm going to go forward because, well, I'll just feel that it's hard to fathom that you've got this individual in a vital, key, dynamic ministry that has fruit and has beautiful things. And then you say, well, hey, he's got this dark side. How could that be? Do we believe you're saying to him he's an abuser, or do we hold on to what we see with our eyes and so that becomes the dominant narrative. And I'm jumping ahead. There are monsters in the church. That's what we have a hard time realizing. How can Christians ever be monsters, especially Christian leaders that have been proven track record, filled, baptized in the Holy Spirit, and give 500,000 of their whatevers to end? There is a monster there, and they do exist in the church. And Paul talks about, Jesus talks, ravenous wolves that are inside the church. And we as congregants and professionals and church members have to realize the depravity of man is in everybody. All of us are capable of doing depraved stuff. And it make us immune just because we're a Christian, baptized in water and baptized in the Holy Spirit. And that's why we're doing what we're doing, is just say, can we give a label to this, an awareness? And one of the first intervention is to recognize there are monsters in the church. And we don't want to accept that. And it's hard to accept that. So here you've got a report from Grant about XYZ person. And Grant, that can't be right. Look at all the things he has done. He's internationally known. He's raised millions of dollars. How can this even be possible? And that's the trouble. That's the struggle. Yes, the narrative that's there that everyone sees, and now you're bringing up something that doesn't fit that narrative. Thank you. All right, I'm going to go. I better get back to what I'm supposed to do. I want to share another screen here. This is by Mary Muth in her studies. You're going to, and the reason I'm doing is you're going to see a separate individual, different time frame, coming up with so much identical material. Okay. So abusive leaders, let me just say it this way. If you notice, I've never abbreviated spiritual abuse as SA. Almost everything else I abbreviate after I've used it a couple times, because I can't, it's so hard for me to put SA, because historically SA stands for sexual abuse in my circles. But, you know, so I didn't do it, but there's some overlap there. Especially if you go back to last week, where individuals have likened spiritual abuse as incest. So they have a distorted view of respect. Abusive leaders demand respect without earning it, by being good, honest, living, and being kind. They demand allegiance as proof of followers' allegiance to Christ. So if you're going to follow Christ, you got to follow me. It's my way or the highway. And if they deviate, then they're guilty of what? Deviating from Jesus. How could you be such a bad Christian? That's shaming. Use excessive language, exclusive language, excuse me. We're the only ministry that's really following Jesus. This is the only way to do things. This is the right theology of ministry or of missions. This is it. Everyone else is wrong, misguided, because we have the truth. Create a culture of fear and shame. There is no grace for someone who fails to live up to the church's or ministry's expectation, because it's too unrealistic. You're not sacrificing enough. You're not suffering enough. You're not giving enough. You've got to do more. And if someone steps outside of the often unspoken rules, leaders shame them into compliance. Those of you that have been in leadership in a situation where you think where there has been spiritual abuse, have any of the leaders ever admit failure or fault? It's just not there. Even in my conversations with leadership, it just, well, Grant, you just not seen it correctly. This is, anyway. I didn't really say that. I didn't do that. I've been involved in some meetings with leadership and member, and trying to bring some reconciliation, healing for something. She was trying to do what she was told to do, the Matthew 18, and we were trying to do that, and it was just so hard for leadership to admit, we made a mistake, we were wrong. Often have a charismatic at the helm who starts off well but slips into arrogance, protectionism, and pride. Where a leader might start off being personable and interested in others' issues, he or she eventually withdraws to a small group of yes people. There it is again. You're surrounded by yes men, yes people, and they isolate from the needs of others. These ministries and churches harbor a cult of personality, meaning if the central figure of the ministry or church left, the entity would collapse, as it is entirely dependent on one person to hold the place together. That's what you're meant to feel and experience. We can't lose him. We can't lose her, because the ministry will fall apart. Well, if that's the case, then it's really not a genuine ministry, is it? cultivate a dependence on one leader or leaders for spiritual information. Personal discipleship isn't encouraged, or it's encouraged in a specific way. And sometimes the Bible gets pushed to the fringes unless the leader's teaching, and then the leader's interpretation of theology trumps the biblical or your personal interpretation of theology. So in other words, I've seen this where, okay, this is what does he say? How does she interpret this? And then we're going to follow that interpretation, not necessarily what the Bible directly would interpret. See that often. And they use it for manipulation purposes, control. Demand blind servitude of the followers, but live prestigious, privileged lives. Especially in a situation where they're supposed to be suffering and sacrifice, then leadership doesn't seem to follow suit with those principles. They live aloof from their followers and justify their material blessings as God's favor and approval of their ministry. What a refrain. Unlike Jesus' instructions to take the last seat, they often take the first seat at events and court others to grant them privileges and special trips that you're supposed to pay for. They typically chase after wealth and often at the expense of the very people they shepherd. They buffer themselves from criticism by placing people around themselves whose only allegiance is to the leader. We got to protect the leader or our inner circle. The leaders in church views are those of those who bring up legitimate concerns as enemies. Those who were once friends, allies, swiftly become enemies once a concern is raised. They hold to outward performance but reject authentic spirituality, or they will feign spirituality, but that in public, but behind closed doors, they don't. They place burdens on the followers to act a certain way as a believer worker, dress an acceptable way, have an acceptable lifestyle, and how they should follow spiritual disciplines, but they often demonstrate licentious, greed, addiction behind closed doors, and do not follow what they demand of others. Got lots of stories about that, where we expect the team members to act a certain way, how to live their lives, what percent to do this, what percent to do that, but then leadership doesn't follow those percentages. And then use exclusivity for allegiance. Followers close to the leaders or leader feels that lucky, like that they're lucky insiders. Oh, I'm inside. I get the perks. And everyone else is on the outside. Though they often long to be in that inner circle, everyone else is outside yet. If someone on the inner circle speaks up about abuses, lapses in character, illegal acts, or strong arming, that insider immediately moves to the outside. Fear of losing their special status often impedes insiders from speaking up. Because if you speak up, you're going to get punished. And there's dead bodies out there already that have been punished, and people know that. I'll pause there. Questions, comments, reactions? I know this is heavy.
Take a look at that box. There's some comments that have been made. Maybe you would like to address some of the comments. If not, Nathan and Beth, if you have anything you want to share, but take a look at that chat box. Just make sure we're covering things. One, Faith, Beth, talks about many times, it's just not large mega settings, but also very small settings too, where a spiritual take place. So something that's not a mega type situation.
Yeah, it can happen in a real small church. Easy. Yes. Good point.
And Grant, can you also, this has come to me as well during this week, that it feels like a lot of these abusive situations are coming from theological backgrounds and churches that have a lot of fundamentalism and certitude what is like, is there a theological core that's driving this kind of behavior? I mean, you've talked a lot about their characteristics, but I wonder theology wise, we've talked about examples of negative. So I'm also wondering about what our church currently, especially our more fundamental churches, what are we
Mhm.
embracing that's then giving us birth to these kinds of personalities that get into the pulpit?
I, um, boy, that's a great question. Um, and I have been in a church. I've never been in a church leadership. I was on the board once, twice on a church board. Um, and I got a document coming up here. It's the next one, Beth, that talks about how a spiritually abusive leader is made, the factors that go into that. My background is missions. And so seeing a missions organization through my life and as an MK and then as an adult, um, a theology of suffering that is really fundamental to controlling individuals on the to go overseas, and it's a misuse of a theology of suffering, and there's no doubt I'm my life is totally committed to Jesus Christ. If he said, Grant, tomorrow I want you to go XYZ, I would do XYZ. And if it meant giving up stuff, I would give up stuff. That's from my heart. But to then say you're not suffering enough, or you haven't given enough, you need to give everything. You need to lay your family on the line, your children on the line. It's a misuse of the theology of servanthood, the misuse of theology of suffering. I actually, and so that to me is, and it comes back to a legitimate, we got to go into all the world. Absolutely. Souls are at stake here, right? Eternity is forever. And so there is a legitimate desire to evangelize, to carry out the biblical mandate of going to all the world. So that theology can then become weaponized,
Right.
to forget about other theological principles of grace and mercy, and taking care of your family, and taking care of your marriage, and taking care of your body. Those are irrelevant in certain circles because go ahead, Beth.
Well, and then I also feel like because we have an atmosphere where questions are not encouraged, that it doesn't feel to me like our church background has had a lot of room for safety in exploring and grappling and just plain old asking questions that we have much better at answers. So I can see how you're right with the theology of suffering being lifted, and then a lot of absolutes. We don't create an atmosphere for people except to be subservient to leadership.
Mark, were you going to say something? No.
No, I just want to draw people's attention to the chat box as well. People are making some very good comments that align with what you're saying, and also just are worthy to be read.
Let me go to the next one here, Kang. And this is how it happens from Michael Kruger. And you're just going to, as you see this, you're going to realize, wow, duh. Um, so factors in making a potential spiritual abuser: the celebrity, pastor, leader, missionary culture that attracts and rewards narcissistic personalities. We live in a culture where we do hero worship. We want somebody that is famous or smart or gifted or great teacher, orator, whatever, that can bring a lot of fame, fortune, um, press. And so churches today are looking for pastors or that can really be, I'm not saying worshiped, but kind of they are heroes. So we're after cult people versus somebody that has a character that is Christ-like. So all of us probably have some hero in athletics or leadership roles, music, whatever, and there are heroes. We value them. And then we've got pastors. I mean, when you think about people like Mark Driscoll, what an orator, what a great person, brilliant. And so, and Steve Timmis in Acts 29, unbelievable ministry. Boom. So we are looking for celebrities, even in the church, even in missions. We're looking for celebrity missionaries that can guide us and instruct us. 2, a model of pastoral or missionary ministry that values gifts and or doctrine over character. That is, there's, so in other words, how much gifting if healing or raising funds or in getting new employees and team members or having the right doctrine. That is, we want to bring that person into a leadership role, not that he or she is humble or gentle or has humility or wants to serve, eagerly serve. In fact, in the Titus stuff, of all of the gift of the characteristics or factors of what a bishop is supposed to be, only one of those of the 9 of those traits, only one had to do with gifting. That was teaching. All the rest were character traits of what Paul and Peter are saying. This is what a true leader is. So if we're going after giftings and spiritual gifts and having the correct doctrine that trumps biblical interpretation, then you definitely are setting yourself up for a spiritual abuser. Number 3, a lack of substantive, meaningful accountability from the elders or boards overseeing the ministry. That is over and over and over again. That it's just, where is the accountability board? Where's the supervision? And you have a chorus of yes individuals, yes men, yes women, that and people will bring boards around them that know they'll agree with them, that will not challenge them. And I was on a board once. This was not with the church, but another one. But it was in a meeting, educational meeting, and I'm pretty vocal. If I'm on a board, I'm representing somebody, so I need to. And I spoke up, and it was like, wow. All I did was just raise an issue, and I was said, no, we're not going there, Grant. And I just like, oh, wow, okay, and so I shut up, and didn't stay long. If my voice is not wanting to be valued, then okay. But that's spiritual abuser. The board is not being accounted. They're not accounted. Oh, and here's the other thing that goes with that is these type of abuses are not involved in credentialing many times. So if it's not a credentialing issue, how can it be spiritual abuse? And so how do you then remove people if the abuse is spiritual abuse, but there's no quote unquote violation of credentials or the policies? And that's a board then has to deal with that, and they don't. This goes to that question maybe a little earlier about the theology, a profound misunderstanding how Jesus wants leaders to wield their authority. So there's a misunderstanding of what true biblical authority is. And so if we are interpreting that the leader is God's anointed and can do whatever she wants and is the spokesperson of God, then they wield that authority for their gain, then that is spiritual abuse. And
Grant, can we pause a moment? Grant,
yes.
Hang on a second. Pause just a moment to address several questions that have come in related to points that were made before. And I'm wanting to make sure that, let's begin here with Christian to everyone. I'll read it. I heard that some pastors are shepherds and some are prophets. Prophets might be more bold and err on the side of truth. Shepherds are on the side of grace. No one can do perfectly with truth and grace like Jesus did. Do you think there is room in the church for both?
I do. And clearly, as my background is as a Pentecostal AG person, I do believe in prophetic ministry, and that is a gift of the church. I'm not skilled in that regard. I'm not a theologian, and don't profess to be. I'm a teacher and a psychologist, but so I will defer to my theologians about that. But I definitely believe, even when you look at the word in the Greek on the term ministry minister is not there. It's servant, and the servant is a shepherd. And so it's almost like our pastors should be called not pastors, but servants and shepherds. And so I don't know what the term bishop is, but anyway, those are different things. But I hope I'm not really answering the question really clearly, but I definitely believe you can be a shepherd and a prophet. I think that's difficult, but it can be done, yes.
Yeah, and I would like to add that there's room for both, and I think often both can be a reflection of call, it could be a reflection of personality as well.
Yes.
But either or can take place, but it doesn't give any excuse for either or to be a spiritual abuser.
Yes.
Or to practice the dynamics of spiritual abuse that you're talking about. So the way, if they have a prophetic type of voice and prophetic type of ministry, that's fine. It's usually not foretelling truth, but forthtelling truth that's there, that's being proclaimed, but it doesn't make room or allowance or excuse for behaviors that would be defined as spiritual abuse. Another from Glenn and Jan, can steward versus servant leadership be used to justify authoritarian approach of spiritual abuse? And they have C article in Influence Magazine, quote, servant leadership or steward leadership.
Yes, there's that. I mean, that's using that. Yes. You can, being a steward, almost all these individuals started out as servants and stewards and of the word, and then it changed, it shifted, where then they used that authority to authoritarianism is really a huge component of being a spiritual abuser. And so being a steward, a servant, if you look at both of those, that's clearly a shepherd. And it's not about you. You are God has put you in a leadership role maybe, and that you should take that with great sensitivity, great humility and understanding, and a sense of, okay, Lord, that fear in an awe fear, not in a terror fear, but an awe fear. I am in God's appointed me in this position, and it's a sacred call and a sacred duty. And I see that as missing from spiritual abusers, that sense of it's a sacred call. Is there another question,
Well-
Mark? And I don't know if I
well-
did a good job on that one either.
You did fine. Because we don't have the article at hand, but just the way you addressed it is good. Heidi and Lauren and Marie have made some good comments that are worth reading.
Please.
But then AOG Lebanon, I think going towards the bottom of the question that they have, where does the line of spiritual abuse get crossed and an avenue for accountability is possible? Maybe backing up a little bit. Well, I'll just read it. With an emphasis on leadership, executive, regional, especially area, local teams, which much is done to facilitate administrative teams, but it's often stated that being pastoral and conformity to that vision is basically mandatory. Where does the line for spiritual abuse get crossed and an avenue for accountability is possible?
Okay, so let me do it this way, gang. On our fourth podcast, we're going to deal with healing, both for individuals and what we believe can be done for organizations and churches. So what I'd like to do is let me finish this. This is the last of my presentations. Finish up this on the screen, and then just kind of open it up there with what further questions there may be. But there's absolutely no doubt that accountability, lack thereof, is really, and the lack of a clear-cut definition of what spiritual abuse is, or recognizing that that is something we need to be paying attention to. There's a study done in the UK by a lady, and I'm blanking on her name. Her survey had 66 people in 66% of her survey, they attested to being spiritually abused in their churches. And so it wasn't kind of what we would say a representative norm sample, but the sample size that she had was pretty large. So let me go number 5, a posture of defensiveness, where leadership decides to protect the pastor, the minister, the missionary, and the integrity of the office or position by circling the wagons, and then litigate criticisms and discard the prophetic warnings from other people. The messenger's the problem, not the message. So this is in abusive organizations, this is a key part. You don't have, and that's what someone was referencing, there is not this chain of command or where something is in place to be able to present these concerns and to be heard and to be valued. And so this defensiveness is embedded in a spiritually abusive situation. And then the last one, and this is what I shared earlier, a wrong view of depravity. There are no monsters in church ministry or missionary leadership. We kind of gotta, I'm repeating, but every human being is capable of doing wrong. Okay? We have to, it's just, we're human nature. Now, as we theoretically get more discipled, more mature, and that probability goes down. But as a church, we just have a hard time believing that somebody could be that bad in a leadership role. And we have to change that thinking. We have to change that worldview, and the view of the church, culture of the church, or culture of missions in general is there are monsters in church leaderships and missionary organizations and evangelical organizations. And we have to be prepared to address those issues in a more direct way. And it's got to be more than just credentialing. It's got to be providing an atmosphere or an avenue or an openness where we want to know the truth, what is going on. I'm going to stop this one and then pull up one more, the reference one, gang.
Here's a good question from Christian to everyone.
Please.
I'll go ahead and bring it now. And he writes, I struggle with creating a victim mindset while being under a spiritually abusive person. I think of David under Saul and how he honored his God-given, and in brackets, but very broken, authority even when abused. I'm wondering, how do I honor my authority when I feel I've been abused?
Excellent question. First thing I would suggest, yes, accept the fact that God's anointed, quote unquote, or authority may be a monster. That's number one. Number two is, yes, you being a victim doesn't mean you have a victim mentality. And that's another part that comes out with Mike's book is grace is cheap. And you're supposed to just move on and not do anything and just forgive. But accept the fact that you are a victim is not victim mentality. That means you are been wounded, you've been injured, you've been harmed, you've been mistreated by friendly fire. This is by your church father, your church family. And that is devastating. And we'll talk more about how to heal from that in 2 weeks. But first step, yes, this is abusive. I was a victim of abuse. I have been mistreated by the church. And I didn't deserve it. I'm not a bad person for that. I'm not dishonoring the Jesus or the call by saying there is injustice here. And we as believers have to stand up for when people are not being treated justly. If we stay silent, in some sense, we're like Eli. And I'm not saying we're that, but the element of when there is injustice, we have to speak up if we're in a position to do that. And that's why you have outside folks or that can do that. But thank you for sharing that. Yes, you can be a victim and not have victim mentality because you truly are a victim. And just the fact that you asked that question means what? That you're trying to honor the situation. And I commend you for that. And follow-up question, or I'll get on the chat here and see if I can figure out something.
Everyone read the comments that are made in the chat box. There's some very good comments that are good reminders and some good counsel as well.
Oh, they are so good. You know what I'm going to do?
Grant, this is Nathan here.
Please.
Yes, I'm not on.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Nathan.
Yeah.
Okay, looking back at my Air Force days, there were tons of regulations that defined abusive behavior, what was appropriate, what was inappropriate, and what to do about it, and accountability, how the organization as a whole would be accountable.
Mhm.
And that was a secular organization. I've been kind of amazed coming into a religious organization since retirement. And first of all, noticing that the government, because of separation of church and state, has no accountability for church religious organizations other than guardrails against child abuse and
Mhm.
gross financial negligence. Other than that, there's they have pretty much have a hands-off policy and leave it to the churches to define what is acceptable and what is not, and do the policing. Unfortunately, the churches, many of them don't recognize what abuse is in general, and they don't reference what's done in the secular world to see what they could learn from it. And so we end up developing a whole system that has virtually no accountability. And so that's inherent in the legal setup of separation of church and state. It does make a problem where we can have monsters whenever we as a organization don't find and look for ways to hold each other accountable, because we're
Mhm.
still humans.
There was a question here. What is victim mentality?
Mhm.
Great
def-
question. Sorry, Mark.
They write, could we define a victim mentality?
Victim mentality is, I never thought it this way in this context, but it's almost the being a narcissist that has experienced suffering to a certain degree, and that's not the right word, where now victim mentality is, I am entitled. That's where I'm going with this. Because I've been mistreated this way or treated that way, I and my group has been treated this way or that way, or my race or my gender, I am entitled to special preferential treatment. That's victim mentality. Play the race card, play the gender card, play my childhood card, that then somewhat takes away responsibility for his or her behavior. It justifies what she is doing or he is doing that may not be very healthy, or doesn't take responsibility for their own behavior and then blame something else for it.
And Grant, on the victim side, there's some research by Savage that points out that as we become victims ourselves, our normal reaction is to withdraw.
Yes.
And so we end up withdrawing from being involved in church more and more as we're victimized more and more, until finally we leave the church totally.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we end up having a church of pew sitters who are there, but they're no longer active or functioning in the church because of the abuse they've experienced. They have
Yes.
withdrawn. And that is a normal response. And sometimes we expect that person to speak out against the abuser, but we have to remember the normal human response to abuse is to withdraw.
That's a natural reaction. Yes. Fight, flight. And so.
And our people, I think the term a victim is also misused and becomes a label to certain people who maybe use it and then threaten the leader. And so it becomes something that people don't want to talk about. And like Nathan said, they just pull back because they don't want to be labeled the troublemaker in the church. And often they do just go out the door and never come back to church. I think that's the end result of a lot of that behavior.
And the sad part about spiritual abuse is devastating and damaging and destructive it is so hard to litigate it or bring charges against someone, that because it's hard to even within secular, how do you, has to be spiritual, it has to be sexual or physical or violent or monetarily. But then the spiritual abuse, it's an emotional, psychological destruction. So it really fits under psychological, emotional abuse, but worse. And so that's, and then with churches or entities, some of the only thing they can do authoritatively is credentialing, remove credentials or dismiss from the organization, but that doesn't help the victim. The victim is, where's the compensation for victim?
To me, the first step of accountability would be to define spiritual abuse as moral failure, and we don't.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, and I just saw a comment here. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, yeah, maybe I'm alluding to the same one, but Heidi says the word victim can be used by a spiritual abuser. Quote, "You're not a victim," unquote.
Yeah. Just
kind of some others have said as well, what Jonathan Stiles shared earlier. And then Brianne Stevens asked this question: are there support groups available for those who have experienced this type of abuse and trauma?
I'm not aware of any, but I'm
Maybe
that there's I'm some of the individuals I've talked to in preparing for this through the 3 months is, what can we do to help? What can we do to heal? And we're going to do that, okay, in 2 weeks. But one of the things that has crossed my mind was to start a support group. I don't know how, I've had several ideas thing how to do it. One would be Zoom thing or DoxyMe thing. Another would be to have a conference, a weekend conference somewhere. And we just, the whole weekend is spent in following a model that works with being abused. Brianne, are you aware of any? I don't know if you can, if you're still on, but does,
I'm not.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not. I see it so much. And I know Jackie and I are in the same practice, and we see it so much, but people who have gone through this need more than the individual counseling to help them through it. Like they
Yes.
need support because it happened in a community setting oftentimes, right? And so we
Yes.
heal in community as well.
And I think Brianne will get this. The Jones trauma model that's done in community and groups has been very effective in Kenya in helping this process. And so, and the other part here, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, but the healing has to involve somebody that really knows correct biblical theology. It can't be somebody that doesn't understand scripture, because so much of the abuse is the misuse of theology. And so and then where is God? How could he allow this? Does he even care about me? And why didn't he prevent it? I talked to people and nothing happened. Where is the Lord in this process? So you've got to deal with those abandonment issues, even from the Lord, in the process of also being abandoned by the organization or the church. Go
Grant,
ahead.
yeah, that's an excellent point. That could be something to think about setting up at some time, even on Zoom. I think a weekend time also sounds great as well, but in the interim, perhaps something on Zoom, so come one, come all can happen.
Yes.
With confidentiality. Brandon Cox writes to everyone, if I heard Nathan correctly, towards the very beginning of today's session, I believe he said that if you were in ministry as long as he's been, it's likely you've been an abuser at some point. And please forgive me if I misheard. With that comment in mind, and knowing that I'm capable as well, what can we do to get ahead of people abusing for years? What methods can we set up within, here's AG, but I think any church organization, any institution, to address a matter, for instance, early on and have a leader correct it rather than dismissing it for so long? that it becomes a quote monster unquote? Or is it just due to their true narcissism that monsters are going to be monsters? That a monster is going to be a monster?
Let me go
Nathan?
ahead and address part of that. And that, yes, if someone's a narcissist, they're going to be a monster. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't have the accountability method within our organization to identify and hold them accountable and eventually revoke their credentials for being an abuser. That's why I said we need to start by identifying abuse itself as a moral failure that deserves holding credentials. So the first step is redefining abuse to be a moral offense that deserves a credential response, so that the repeat offender can be ushered out of ministry. So that's one very important issue. That we're going to get into this a lot on the fourth session, where we have going to have a good dialogue, I believe, in what can the organization do, what can we as individuals do. So I don't want to really get too much ahead, but we'll be getting into this quite heavily in the fourth session.
Yeah, someone just made a great comment that the studies and approaches to moral injury are definitely, I'm saying they are very effective in helping treating this kind of what you're referencing in terms of not only maybe the abuser, but definitely the victim. Thank you, Kit, for doing that. That's a great, and I've been exposed to that literature, and it really is fascinating. It's come about in the last 10, 15 years. So.
Carla also makes a comment. I'm noticing a distinction between an ability to recognize, quote, I am a victim of abuse, unquote, which is a difficult conclusion to face, and wielding the, quote, victim card, unquote, as a way of dismissing my own responsibility for my behavior.
Yes.
I also liked Heidi had a response of a way to, do you want to read hers? It was a good response to spiritual direction as a way to have a lot more introspection. I think this is a missing piece of our education as ministers, is to have that person outside of ourselves to speak to us and help us to see ourselves and also hear God's voice in spiritual direction. So she had a good comment there as well. Thank you, Heidi, for that.
Yeah, and I would really encourage people to have a spiritual director. Heidi mentions here Alicia Choli as helpful to her. And this isn't self-promotion or aggrandizement, but I have my certification in spiritual direction from Southern Methodist University and have a practice going now, and thoroughly enjoy doing it. And it's purely confidential. So if anybody's interested in talking about having that, there's a place to sign up on the website, iamwholeness.org, but you could also write me directly at the email address that I provided at the top of the chat box. But I completely agree. And I believe in more evangelical, even Pentecostal settings, we're going to start seeing the growth of spiritual direction. It's an ancient practice. It's not coaching, it's not mentoring, it's not counseling, but it really is coming alongside someone and discovering what God is doing. And I find it absolutely amazing what God does once a month in an hour session. So I agree with you, Heidi, completely.
Mark, that comment that you made about somebody that you read just before that, I didn't find it here, but if that person, and if you can just respond back to that person, for that person just to email me at Grant Jones PhD with that same question, I will try to respond to it directly to her. And anybody else have a direct question, please, I will respond to them. You just email those questions, grantjonesphd@gmail.com, and I will be honored to try to respond to them.
Yes, and just for everyone, you can write us directly. We put our email addresses at the top of the chat. You can scroll up there and take a photo shot or record it somehow. We have gone past our time, but I think we need to pull it in. And Grant, do you want to comment to your spiritual abuse resources here?
Yes.
And then we can conclude and we'll talk a bit about next week as well, because next week will be unique.
So here, the spiritual abuse resources, there's my email. The Fletcher and the Von Vandering, those are 2 video broadcasts. They're outstanding, each about an hour long. They're game changers. Then Dave and Jeff had the book, one of the originals in 91, The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse. Enroth, about the same time, Churches That Abuse, as well as Ken Blue, Healing Spiritual Abuse. Those are the original early ones. And then the last 3 are in the last couple of years, 2020 and 2022. They're great, all of them. The Chuck one, When Narcissism Comes to Church, gives a lot of insight that I haven't been able to cover today about the connectivity with narcissism and spiritual abuse, or any type of abuse, literally, because they are above the law. They are special. They have divine gifting, authority, and that's in the church. It's, I have a divine special calling from God that allows me to do X, Y, and Z. And then Michael's book, Bully Pulpit, is the one I've used a lot today. These should all be on your shelves, especially those last 3. But anyway, so yeah, that's it. Next week, go ahead, Mark.
Yes. So next week, our series will continue for Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month, and we're going to be talking about spiritual abuse stories from the spiritually abused. We're actually going to have live interviews, people sharing. We have a special guest coming, all are special, that are going to be sharing. We really appreciate them being willing to do that. In this, we're going to keep their anonymity. That's important. And we want to especially emphasize that we are looking to communicate truth. We're not wanting to point out certain churches, certain organizations, but to look at this in an overarching way and to see where truth needs to be applied to those that are victims and those that are victimizers. And we also are going to have another guest next week who is actually a supervisor to me in my spiritual direction program at Southern Methodist University. And his name is Lee Gerald. And interestingly enough, with Lee, he will talk about being spiritually abused, but he's also going to talk about being a spiritual abuser. So it's going to be one of those kinds of takes where we'll see a person who was abused and also is a recovering abuser, in his words. And so again, it'll begin at the same time. We encourage you to go to the iamwholeness.org website and to hit the RSVP for that event. And then you can also then put it into your calendar so that when you do get the letter that will immediately come into your inbox about the next webinar, you'll also have the Zoom link that you can go to and have it in your calendar as well. And so with that, I do believe we need to bring it to a conclusion. I want to thank Dr. Jones and Dr. Davis and Nathan Davis for being a part of this, and they're going to be with us through all the next sessions that we have, which are 2 more. So there'll be 2 more to this next week and the following week. So thank you everyone for joining us. It was great to have you, and we appreciate the time that you've taken to participate in this. So God bless you.